All right, Dad, today is Monday, June 17th. And I was thinking maybe we can start this conversation off just talking about the state of propaganda here in the West. And I want to talk about it because, we are a very small channel, very few views, but, we've only been around for a couple months. But, I've been editing little clips of our podcast and I put one out the other day and it went semi-viral for us. We got over 10,000 views in a very short period of time. But I was very surprised by the comments. Everybody was the clip was very benign, but everybody was saying that this is misinformation and that we are on Putin's payroll and this is Russian
I wish.
propaganda. Yeah, I know. I wish we were. But I figured we can try playing the clip here right now so everyone can hear. This is the first time I've ever tried integrating media into the podcast, so bear with me if it doesn't work.
Okay.
And then we can kind of talk about it from there. So I'm going to play the clip and then we'll go from there. Okay, so tell me if you see it.
But
Should
the
be live?
Russians were big, and
I do see it,
they
yeah.
were smaller than they were. But again, these, like these IMF reports that have come out demonstrated how big they were, right? It was the fourth largest economy, and you were going to cut them out. And by doing that, what were you thinking? That they would just kind of shrivel up and die? Well, you did two things. One is you shot yourself in the foot because you harmed the reputation of your own economic system, right? Your own financial system, and of the dollar itself. But then the other thing you did was to give Russia and all its trading partners a very powerful incentive, to build up an alternative system, a competitor to your own system.
Right.
Okay.
I have to correct myself on one thing. I said IMF reports. It was the World Bank report.
Yeah, tomato. IMF,
Yeah,
World
okay.
Bank. The thing is,
They're closely
both
tied.
both the IMF and the World Bank are Western-built and Western-focused institutions. They have no incentive to try to make Russia look good. They have every
Right.
incentive to do the opposite.
Exactly. Right.
And this is big news, but of course, the vast majority of mainstream media has just ignored it. So
Right,
if you Google
right.
it, you will find it, but it'll be, buried. You can look at the World Bank data directly itself, and there might be a couple articles that talk about this. But
Right.
all 90% of the comments were so aggressive, just saying that this is Russian propaganda, that this is a lie, misinformation, that Russia is not the fourth largest, even though I stated and pinned like the World Bank data, like, well, here's the data that the World Bank itself has revised and said that Russia is the fourth largest economy in PPP terms, surpassing Japan and Germany. And it just didn't seem authentic or natural. Like, where was this coming from? That clip that everybody just heard is, I think, not that controversial.
Yeah, I didn't think it would be. I hardly even thought about it. I thought this was, maybe a little bit too humdrum. We should go on to something controversial, but apparently it was, right?
Yeah, right. So it made me just think, like, where is this coming from? Is this an organic response, in your opinion, or is there something that is more nefarious behind it? I started thinking that is all this money that's being funneled into Ukraine, is a lot of it, we've talked about before, the Ukraine war for the West, it's all about PR. A lot of it is trying to control the narrative, so they have people online to try to suppress any positive news about Russia to keep their narrative going and support pro-Ukrainian messages. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think, first of all, I think it shows the ignorance of the average news consumer in the West. I mean, I think that a lot of people that were simply reacting out of ignorance, they hadn't heard anything about it. They had only heard that, basically that Russia was a joke country. It was Nigeria with snow. It was a gas station masquerading as a country. It was, doesn't even have the GDP of Italy, and possibly, now this report, again, it was by very much a globalist institution. What could be more globalist, and kind of Western oriented really than the World Bank? But it got, as you discovered when you went to research it, it just got very little, almost no play. So the average consumer never heard about it. And they still have this impression of, Russia having a puny economy and just being a pathetic country. Um, so I think that most of it just comes out of ignorance. I'm actually surprised because I was assuming that this kind of I heard about it through my usual sources, which are tend to be Russia friendly or just let's say dissident friendly. I tend to go to dissident news sources first, but I also do try to keep a foot in the camp of the establishment and see what they're saying. I just assumed that it got us some play. It's just, hey, it's the World Bank. This is big news. But it didn't. It was basically suppressed. And the average news consumer knows nothing about it. And I think that's really a startling, revelation. I mean, it tells us, it's a reminder of kind of the depths to which our media have fallen. We are becoming increasingly like our old Soviet nemesis, which was very well known and constantly ridiculed by us in the days of the Cold War as being afraid of all kinds of news, suppressing things, keeping their people ignorant. Well, it seems to be me that that we're doing the same. But you said there may also be something nefarious about it because there clearly are efforts to counter misinformation. There are all kinds of NGOs and pressure from politicians to fight the Russian narrative. The Putin's talking points. Whatever they want to call it. In other words, the news that's just not welcome to the establishment in the West. So we do have these NGOs. We do have government agencies, and like in Ukraine, there are agencies funded by the West that spend their time, just simply battling so-called Russian misinformation, basically just trying to suppress news that puts Russia in a positive light and, push the Ukrainian and Western narrative. So it's possible that some of that reaction was from those people. I'm flattered, but it's certainly possible. It's known that this happens. Recently there was a news story. Again, I saw it from one of my dissident sources, but I checked. It appeared in Reuters. You can go to Reuters news agency, a British news agency. It was revealed that that the Pentagon actually trash talked the Sinovac, the COVID vaccine developed by China. That they purposely, did their best to badmouth it, to sow doubts about it. In the Philippines because they were alarmed by the growing influence of China at that time in the Philippines, and this was part of an information war in which they just went ahead and lied, of course. But that's just one thing. This one effort was exposed, but who knows how many other efforts that the Pentagon and other government agencies engage in.
Yeah, one thing it's hard for me to believe is that it seems clear that our media has no agency. There is no such thing really as freedom of the press. But how did they consolidate all of Western media to become essentially a propaganda arm of the Western government? Surely shouldn't there be some agency within some media institutions that might be a little bit more dissident, filthy, or anti-establishment? How are they all in lockstep? How is it that nothing, it's scary when you think about that. And then that's what creates, because I think it's so important for the state to say we have a consensus. And so they want to make sure everybody stays in line and says that, okay, don't talk about this.
In a way I do, I find it hard to believe, but it's what's happened. It didn't happen overnight. I mean, back in the 60s and 70s, back then, still there was a stereotypical reporter. He was hard-boiled, cynical. He enjoyed muckraking, sticking it to the man. Journalism attracted a certain kind of rebellious personality. But that has changed over the years. I think maybe for different reasons. Part of it is economic. There's been growing centralization, which makes it easier, of course, for the government to control the media. I remember that happening back in the 70s, newspapers. There used to be, just an abundance of local newspapers, local TV stations, whatever things. These local news outlets were bought up by chains, became part of these nationwide chains, and now, increasingly too. So again, that's part of it. It makes the control easier. But I think another thing is education. It's just that education is, like journalism schools have been, and undergraduate and graduate institutions in general have been turning out people who are really think it is their duty to really to serve the government, to be, subservient to the elite. And I don't think they see it that way, but that's what's happened. There's been this total identification of products of elite universities with the elite. It's part of becoming the elite is that, identify with the elite. And these are the kind of people that staff media outlets now, the mainstream ones. I think in the old days too, it was more likely you would get like a working class person who can actually work his way up through a newspaper. Somebody who was really didn't have the education, had a good command of the language and, was good at ferreting out stories and whatever. But now you have people, they have degrees from Columbia or wherever, and they tend to be, already have this outlook that's puts them in line with with the establishment, and they kind of feel it's their duty to repeat it they consider it like their moral duty to actually propagate the narratives that are out there, the good narratives, so-called. It's still, I find it rather amazing, but it just seems to, it's just a fact. It's just these stories that are huge, and we've seen, others over the last few years. They just don't. If you're a mainstream news consumer, you just don't know. It's not that it was just spun to you in a certain way, or maybe it was downplayed. That of course happens, but sometimes they're just entirely suppressed. Nobody mentions them.
Mm-hmm.
There was one thing that came out recently. It was just the fact of the peace treaty that was being drawn up between Ukraine and Russia at the outbreak of the war in 2022. Just about a month afterwards, they pretty much had it to, they had been initialed and by both sides, and they agreed to work out further details. But there was this peace treaty that both sides had, in its main points had agreed to. And I remember hearing it about the time because, of the news sources that I tend to look at, but it was not reported in the mainstream press, and it's only now coming out. Like the New York Times just a couple of days ago finally reported it, but they gave it a spin. They didn't talk about the fact, which those people who directly participated in the negotiation process, including the head Ukrainian negotiator, about the fact that Boris Johnson came and told him to not to go ahead with it, backing from the U.S. So this is something, it's finally come out in the New York Times 2 years after the fact, but they gave it a certain spin, and they're still suppressing aspects of the story. And it came out in the Wall Street Journal a couple months ago. But again, approximately 2 years afterwards, a huge story. So if you didn't know it, you would be surprised. You would think oh, they just discovered this. It's funny, I knew about it 2 years earlier, right?
Right. You think there should be a very powerful incentive to, speak truth to power, as they say, expose corruption. That's the job of the media, to hold the government accountable. But it seems like, I guess, the halls of power are just so intoxicating that when they have the choice of, becoming the propaganda mouthpiece of the government, that power pull is so strong that it overrides the duty and the actual lifeblood of a news agency. It's a short-sighted thing because they are becoming a propaganda piece and just sort of spoon-feeding us whatever the government spoon-feeds them, that it's going to hurt them in the long run. It's
Yeah.
a very short-sighted policy, and we're seeing it through happened legacy media. And you would think that at least one media organization would be like, okay, we're going to not be corrupted by the halls of power. We may not get invited to all the fancy dinner parties and certain press conferences, but at least we know we have integrity and we're doing our job. You think
Yeah.
there would be at least one mainstream media news source that would do that, but there isn't. So it makes me feel like, what is it? Is it just that power pull, or is there money going directly to these media organizations from the government or is there
Yeah.
some type of agreement, or is it just something that we don't know? We'll just call it the deep state. It's just
Yeah, well, I'm
expanded.
sure. I mean, there are deep state pressures. Well, one thing that happens again and again is like the CIA builds up relationships with journalists, and I think this is always true. But you did have exceptions to the rule. You can give an example in the Vietnam War. The Pentagon Papers is something that the deep state did not want to, uh, to be revealed, but they were, so there were, back then they actually did dissent from government policy and took risks, incurred some government wrath. But it's always been true that there has been this tendency that, to just for certain journalists at elite media institutions to establish cozy relationships with, let's say, people in the CIA or, other parts of the security state. Um, and, these people will give them information and, they can publish it, and and, refer to their sources, and it gives them a certain amount of prestige. Maybe it gives them some, edge over their rivals. And so they want to maintain this reputation. They don't want to do something that's going to anger their contacts within these agencies, because then that'll dry up and they'll be on their own. They'll have to do real journalism again. So there is those corrupting relationships that have always been there, and that pressure. But I think it's there were also, truly independent voices, and those just seem to have disappeared, have become, increasingly rare. In the they're pretty much entirely gone from the media landscape now. I think with the loss of Tucker Carlson, he was the last one who actually went against some of these sacred policies, dissented on really matters of really important substance. And well, not too surprisingly, he was, even though he had the most popular show, which shows again that actually
Right.
people want to hear about these things and trust. They have the sense that he's actually telling us something true. But even this was clearly not in their own interest. But these people that lead these media institutes, they're not thinking even. Sometimes they'll even go against the bottom line. They want to maintain those relationships, with their counterparts in the government, and also, I think, again, because they identify so much with it, they agree. Their people are telling, "Oh, this Tucker, he's doing terrible things. He's really, hurting our cause." And I know he's making money for you, but you've got to do the right thing and get rid of him. And I think they respond to that because they identify so much with the establishment.
Mhm. Yeah, it's such a short-sighted, dumb thing to do, though, because you were saying how, like, nowadays it's maybe there are more tools, so it's easier to control the narrative. But I think it's the opposite, actually. I mean, they have created a void of truth,
Hmm.
and it's being filled by people like us. Just
Right.
any people that are actually doing real research, looking at things and saying this doesn't make sense, calling the media out in its lies, and they can't control it. This isn't the Soviet Union, because there are so many different ways to access information now.
Right.
So it's like they didn't calculate that into their thought at all. It's just further exposing themselves and leading to the decline of their hegemony, and just just it's exposing a real Orwellian state. It's crazy to
Yeah.
think that not only just here in the U.S., but it's all of Western Europe, and
Yeah.
Canada and Australia too. It's the media gets its directives from basically the White House. We don't know who the hell's even running the White House. It's clearly
Hmm.
not Biden. So yeah, it seems like it's the CIA more than it is anything else, that gets
Uh-huh.
to control a lot of these news stories. Um,
Yeah. No,
but
it's
it's a
right.
miscalculation. It's a miscalculation
Right.
of the board.
Well,
Like
I mean,
there's a lot of
yeah. Yeah, but I'd say no. I agree with you, and certainly polls show that the trust that people have in the mainstream media has plummeted over the last decade or so. Where so yeah, they are hurting themselves. There more and more people are skeptical. It doesn't mean that they necessarily really know what's going on. I don't know. There are a lot of news sources out there. I like to think that we're presenting the truth, and I believe we are. But some of them are just, crackpot and whatever. There are all kinds of things that people, when the establishment, when people no longer believe in the establishment, they end up believing in all kinds of things, whether true or false or whatever. But at the same time, these people do. I mean, uh, though skepticism has increased, no question about it, increased greatly, they still have a lot of influence. And there's still a lot of people out there that just tend to trust what the mainstream says. The number of dissenters grows with every day, but there's still the majority are kind of in that category. Maybe they're not quite so, they don't have the trust that they used to, but by and large, they believe what the mainstream media tells them,
Mm.
whether it's so-called conservative or so-called, liberal. Um, and then within the establishment, you say, okay, these people tend to be quite smart, well educated, but they, by and large, they're the ones that kind of wrap themselves most completely in the mainstream narrative, who are entirely within the mainstream bubble. And I think, again, it's because, this is the establishment narrative, and they understand to be a part of the establishment, it's important for them to keep on believing it and repeating it. Maybe it's subconscious more than conscious, but that's what you find. That's just been my experience, would speak to friends and, for example, that are still,
Right.
are part of it. Again,
Yeah.
I'm
Well,
not
I mean,
accusing them of being dumb, but they really have this trust in the
yeah, no, it's
that they shouldn't
because
have.
I mean these institutions, the New York Times, everything, the U.S. government as a whole, the CDC or whatever, they built up their reputations over hundreds of years by being
Right.
honest and
Right.
truthful, or at least having some, maybe
Yeah.
not on everything, but overall,
Right.
people were
Right.
like this thing. The reason the New York Times has weight is because it was a trusted news organization for over
Right.
100 years, right? I mean, it was something that people really built up. And then what we have now throughout every level of government is that they are taking advantage of that trust that was built over all the years and weaponizing it. But in
Yeah.
doing so, they're destroying the institution because the
Right.
institution only exists and has validity because of that trust of being honest. And so
Right.
now they're just throwing it all away
Yeah.
on every single level, every
Yeah.
governmental level. I feel like so,
Yeah.
and they
And
should
the
know
short,
that.
yeah, in the
They should
short run, it
understand
works
it.
for them. Again,
Right,
and a
right.
lot
You
of
can you
people,
can win
maybe
but
10 or maybe even 20 years for one generation or something, it might work. But
right.
in the end, you've thrown it away and you can't get it back. You're
Right, that's right.
right,
It won't come back. So I mean, think
right.
about all these great institutions that we built and spent so much time, whether it's
Yeah,
medical journals or media
uh-huh.
journals or government institutions.
Right.
They're dead. You killed them.
Mhm.
They're bleeding out right now. You can see it, and just
Yeah,
like you said, opinion polls show that trust in the media has been plummeting, and everybody knows that. And instead, what do? The obvious solution is to say, hey, maybe we should start telling the truth and speak truth to power and
uh-huh.
admit when we lie and mess up and
Right.
then move on. And then maybe we can salvage our reputation and the newspaper can live on. But instead, they go the route like, well, we're the media, so we just will suppress that news
Right.
about the poll.
Yeah.
Not
Right.
us. People don't
Yeah.
trust us.
Well,
Just
yeah.
don't report it,
Yeah.
and then
Well,
they'll
actually,
trust us.
for one thing, is they no longer really are all that concerned with the truth. It's all about the narrative and partisanship, right? Being on the right team. And that's, what you see, you come out, that's what people who actually thought that they were kind of liberals and leftists, people like Matt Taibbi and so forth, they found out, they started saying, well, I've dug up these really interesting facts, this should be alarming. The government is censoring social media platforms, and runs against everything that our sacred First Amendment. But he just gets a lot of hate from what he thought were his fellow liberals. It was because this this helped Trump somehow. That's the way they think. It's just that, it's not so much, is this true or is it not? And this happens, of
Right.
course, on both sides of the political spectrum. Does it help the other side? And if it doesn't, then you're a traitor and you ought to shut up. Now, there used to be, that's always been part of it, partisanship, and this has always been a part of the political landscape, a big part of it. But it just has reached certain extremes where there used to be a middle, and there used to be institutional integrity. It was clear that, for example, the New York Times was, tilted towards the liberal side, and has always been, has supported Zionism. But overall there was a good amount of institutional integrity, and an effort to to a devotion to the truth that, yeah, it wasn't perfect. You can point to some real serious lapses, but all in all, it was there, and it was true, I think, of a lot of these different institutions. But it's just gone now. It's just pure partisanship.
Hmm. In a way, I'm almost glad that they're
Yeah.
just shooting all of their guns off at once. They have these institutions, the reputation they built. We'll just throw it all out the window and try to do whatever we can to control the narrative, because it's going to, allow us to create a new media landscape. And I think that new media landscape is going to be very decentralized. I mean, it already is. And that's the way it needs to be, because otherwise we'll always have this problem of being corrupted by the halls of power if it's not decentralized. So it'll be interesting to see, how it just seems almost like the natural cycle of civilization. When I look at China, after living there for so long, the period between 1980 and now, the development, it all got to start from scratch and new. So all the buildings you see, the infrastructure, the high speed rail, it's super high tech, brand new. Because they started at a different point of the development stage. And so now, when we go to, like we said before, like go to Hong Kong or Taipei, it feels old and dilapidated. And it feels the same way in the US. And then you feel like what's happening in Russia now, they're having this new wave of energy and innovation to build the next cool thing. And right now we're in the dying stage of the empire. But the exciting part is the rebirth of it, what comes out of it. As these institutions crumble, we get to build new institutions, and we can build it with the new technology we have available,
Right.
and
Yeah.
learn the lessons of, this is the scary part. Hopefully we learn the lessons of the past, and we use this new technology to build a better decentralized world instead of a more authoritarian,
Yeah.
scary world, which is also possible.
Right.
But I don't think that's the way it'll go. I'm optimistic that, because, like we're saying, it's becoming more and more exposed. I don't think they'll be able to get away with implementing like central bank digital currencies and, controlling everybody's thoughts, which they're trying to do. But the fact that at least it was exposed, like with the Twitter files with Matt Taibbi, that story is huge. It still blows my mind that it didn't get as big. It didn't make it a big media splash like it should have.
Yeah.
The
For the
fact
same.
that,
Right.
so
Not something that was one that they couldn't totally suppress, but they certainly downplayed it and gave it a certain spin. They
Yeah.
tried to say, yeah, nothing's going on here. Look the other way. It's
yeah, right.
so you just have to go directly to the source. So that's why, again, these journalists like Matt Taibbi, he's one very good example of it. He decided, just to strike out on their own, set up an account on Substack and have done very well. It's
Yeah. Well, I mean, would you say that we really have made essentially a complete 180 in terms of our media here, that it is now the equivalent of a Soviet era state sponsored news, I mean,
yeah, well, right, except that we have the advantage of the internet. That if you think you're getting fed misinformation, there are alternatives, and if you make an effort, you will find them. Right. And that was true to some extent, even the Soviet Union. There were these samizdat publications, but that entailed some risk and some difficulty. And you could listen to the Voice of America secretly at night. I remember meeting some Russians this one guy I met actually in Taipei, right after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and his English was flawless. And I said, how did you learn to speak such good English? And he said, I would listen to the Voice of America at night, like in my bedroom.
That's cool though. I mean, that's
Yeah.
when we were a beacon of light and truth.
Yeah,
And now
yeah,
it's funny.
right.
Now
I know.
it's funny that I have to go to like RT News to see,
Yeah, right.
that's banned
Right, I know.
in
It's a total
America.
flip-flop. No, see, back then, like nobody was scared about Soviet misinformation and there was plenty of it. They often, I guess you go back and you realize in the Cold War, we weren't always right. Sometimes we lied. Sometimes the Soviets were telling the truth. But all in all, I think, we were the truth tellers by far, far more than the Soviets were. And they did indulge in a lot of lying and just suppression of facts. And, there were these Soviet news agencies, but nobody was worried about anybody reading them because, we just knew that was propaganda, and and it was so easy to find out what was really going on in their own countries. So there wasn't an incentive to secretly listen to a Soviet broadcast at night. It was the other way around. But now there's all this hysteria about Russian misinformation. Why? Because people actually listen to it and say, hey, well, why didn't I hear about that somewhere else? Because it is, then you check on and find out, hey, yeah, that actually happened. Wait a second, what's going on here? I better, and it's not just, it's not just RT, but like Press TV from Iran and what is it, the Global Times, and you say they all have their spin, but their so-called propaganda, by and large, is actually just actually doing real reporting.
Right. Yeah. I mean, just that little clip like we sent out, I think the reason it did well was because it made sense to people, and it was something that they never heard. That was just like, whoa, how come I never heard this? And this makes perfect sense. When you think about it, in those 43 seconds, should be very non-controversial, very concise,
right.
and it's
I didn't even
very
think about
rational. It makes complete sense, and it's happening. It's you can verify it as well. So,
Right.
but like I said, it's just not being. There's just a hunger for it. So once it starts to people see the truth, they like it, and then what's scary is what you see is that you have what it looks like essentially government paid people to suppress that information, to label it as misinformation, and to comment on it and to downvote it without actually stating what is wrong or just lying about it. And 90, I feel like 80% of the comments were saying that we're lying and misinformation. 10% were kind of supportive, and 10% were maybe making fun of your looks, which were accurate. So I think there was
that's fair.
those guys were right on. So
Right.
So, okay, anyways, I think we can move on from that. It's been interesting, and I'm sure we're going to have a lot. This journey is just beginning,
Right.
So, I'm sure we'll get into a lot of heat further down the road. We'll just roll the punches. Okay, anyways, maybe we can talk a little bit about Ukraine and Russia. Maybe we can start with the Putin's peace plan. Putin said that basically said he wants to enter into negotiations right now. They'll have a ceasefire right away if we enter negotiations and talk about drawing the line where it is now.
Yeah. Well, I say
it's
preconditions to negotiations. That is, withdrawal from what he regards or what the Russian government regards as Russian territories there, which is in addition to Crimea is the Donbass and Zaporozhye and Kherson.
What about Luhansk is the region too, right?
Oh, yeah, well, actually, Lugansk is part of the Donbass. When I say that,
Okay.
the Donbass is a collective term for both Lugansk and Donetsk.
Okay.
Yeah. So, yeah, so that was it. And that's actually not surprising. I mean, I don't think anybody should be surprised by that because they held those referenda, and the Russian government, following the results of those, the elections there, the Russian government formally recognized those territories as part of Russia. So it was clear to me that they were not going to give up those territories. But he just repeated this as a fact. And then
Did he
also
speak-
the neutrality, no NATO for it. But that's always been there. That was there from the beginning and even well before. This was the thing that they kept on trying to express. And it used to be nothing about territory. That's something that has to be remembered. There's all this talk about, oh, the Russians are just trying to seize, recreate the Soviet Union. They're just grabbing this land and then they're going to go after Poland or whatever. If you look at it, like the previous offers actually didn't ask for any of the Donbass and certainly not Zaporozhye or Kherson. It was above all about neutrality, no NATO um, for Ukraine, to keeping Ukraine out of NATO. That was the main thing. And that's been there all along. Now it's because, again, that the previous offers were turned down, that we're now where we are. And then this effort was made to go all in on a war against Russia, to damage Russia using Ukraine. Well, okay, now, the terms have changed. Now Russia is going to insist on these territories. So that's something I think it's very significant. It doesn't surprise me what he said. I think it's like, if you've been following it, it was clear that that's basically, these were the minimum requirements that the Russians had for some kind of peace treaty. But I think it's very significant that he went ahead and said it, and in such a clear fashion. And I think just know, if what I've seen of Putin, it makes me, I believe that this indicates that the Russians are planning to make a major move soon. I say soon, it could be a couple of weeks, maybe even, a month or two from now. But if you look in the past, it's like before the SMO began, in the months and then the weeks leading up to it, it was just the Russians were becoming increasingly explicit. They say, we have these requirements. They were laying out what it was that they wanted and giving the other side an opportunity to avoid conflict. And, of course, that opportunity was missed and the SMO was launched. And I think this is maybe something similar. It's just saying, okay, look, this is where you are. You can have this now. Because I think this is the way that Putin thinks. He kind of has a very legal mind, say, we can't go ahead and launch some major operation without first giving them the opportunity, right, to settle this now. And I think he knows that it's almost certain that they're not going to, but it's just ethical, in his own mind. We got to do this. And so I believe that's what we're seeing, and that we're going to see some sort of like a major offensive, probably.
Well, what do you think a major offensive? What do you think a major offensive would look like?
Well, they talked about there's still a lot of forces north of Kharkov and Sumy that have not been committed. So it could be just a major expansion of the offensive there. What they did was actually quite limited. They only, used a small percentage of the forces, but there's supposed to be a lot of forces like right across the border from Sumy. And Sumy actually it's on the way to Kiev. So it could even be a drive towards Kiev. That's possible, but I don't know. And then, of course, but it could be just sort of like just a general uptick in tempo and, all along the front. We'll see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was another Russian spokesperson, the name slips my mind, but basically saying that this was the West's last chance.
Yeah.
The next step is going to be total surrender, complete capitulation from
Right.
Kiev.
I think there seem to be really kind of announcing, that something's up. We're giving you an opportunity to settle things now, to avoid what's coming. But of course, the West is going to ignore it.
How do you think the West will respond to this major offensive that is likely to come?
Yeah, well, that's the thing. That's
clearly
with panic, hysteria, But
right, the right decision is to sit down and negotiate. Work
Right.
on it, and then you can stop the killing, and we can
Right.
work towards peace.
Right.
So I mean that's clearly the best option available. But like you said, we just seem to be incapable of negotiating. It's just not in our DNA anymore. So that's what scares me.
Right,
So will it just
right.
Russia Ukraine completely collapse? what does it mean? What happens to Ukraine? What
Yeah,
happens?
yeah. Well,
It's going to be a very messy situation,
yeah,
you
it's going to
know.
be scary. We've talked about this. There's going to be a moment of truth when it just becomes clear. Uh, when it no is no longer possible to hide. An imminent Russian victory. Like if the Russians are marching on Kiev, they take Kharkov, or they're marching on Odessa, something like that. Or they drive all the way to the Dnieper, or maybe even cross it. One of these. There's just not going to be a way to really downplay it, or to spin it. I mean, even with like the recent, it's clear, and if you're paying attention to mainstream media, there's a growing awareness, that things are not going well for the Ukrainians. But if you're not paying very close attention, again, I look through these Google News feeds, and you would think it's like the Ukrainians continue to do these amazing things, and the Russians are just a bunch of jackasses and whatever. But there'll be a point where they can't even do that anymore, and there's just going to be a general hysteria, and who knows? I still seem to be dealing with very competent or rational people.
Right.
I'd like to think that there are some competent, rational people in these governments, and maybe they'll win the day and avert disaster. But it's going to be scary, because they may feel like they have to commit troops directly. Or
Well, can we? I mean, technically, the United States is supposed to have a vote from Congress to declare war. We haven't done. I know we haven't done that in a long time, but
right, like since
but
World War II.
Right, but I mean, okay,
Yeah,
every war since then has been kind of more minor wars. We're talking about a war with Russia here.
yeah, right.
Surely that has to go through Congress, right? Something that big. Could the president
Yeah.
just start a war against
Well,
Russia and
well, I mean,
nobody votes on it?
Yeah, the fact is that all these wars have been illegal ever since
I
World War
understand,
II. And
but this is
I know
Russia
it's
we're
big,
talking
right?
about.
You would hope so, but I just don't. The Thomas Massey and Rand Paul, will say that, hey, we need to vote on this, and they may get a handful of supporters, maybe from both sides of the aisle, but just a handful. And the rest of them, they're just, they'll go along with whatever the president says.
Well,
that's just what it is now. I mean, that's just a reality in Congress.
Okay, let's just say, even if it did go to Congress, do you think that Congress would are there enough neocons in Congress that they would vote for a war and say make an official declaration of war if it went to Congress?
Well, yeah, no, because it's hard
because maybe they want to do it anyways.
Right,
they want to make it official.
Yeah, right. Because it is. That's the thing. I don't think they would want to vote on it. They want it to happen, and they don't want to oppose the president and all their. But it's got to be unpopular. I don't think there's going to be any support. Now, I may be proven wrong. There may be some kind of false flag or some way that the whole thing's spun, that people think, oh, we got to do this to save the Moldovans or something. I don't know. Just because, just remember like the outbreak of the war in 2022. There was a lot of hysteria, and there was a lot of Ukrainian flag waving in America in small towns, and that's pretty much died away. Actually, right around the corner, there's still one Ukrainian flag right around the corner from here, but that's really rare. That's the only one that I've seen for a long time, and yeah, I think the polls have showed too. It's just that nobody's interested in actually fighting with Russia. But again, it's the U.S. has a history of manufacturing incidents and whipping up war hysteria that start wars. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, the sinking of the Maine and whatever. It's been going on for a long time. So they may have something up their sleeves, but it's going to be a challenge. Again, this is Russia, and people understand right away this is a possibility. They should understand anyway, as a possibility of it going nuclear. And so there's maybe it's just a lack of popular support will put the brakes on it. And then an awareness of our fundamental weakness. This may be not something that's going to be spoken about openly. But we've talked about this in connection with Iran. It's that, there's always this pressure to attack Iran and launch, to bomb Iran and whatever. And we've come close to it, but it's actually seems to be there's real resistance within the Pentagon, and I think it's because they understand something that the general public and the most of the Congress critters don't understand. It's just that, um, yeah, that Iran actually can do real serious damage to, American military bases in the Middle East. Um, and then maybe the same thing with Russia. It's like when you get that close and there's a history or whatever, there's the Pentagon say, actually, we don't really have the ground forces to oppose them.
Right.
And it would actually look really bad if it's going to look a lot worse than it looks right now if we just say, okay, we're just going to not get involved. Well, it's going to look an awful lot worse if you actually commit troops and they're defeated. So let's not do it. That may happen, but
Right.
it's just hoping, banking on a few sane heads here and there.
Right. Well, the West is always going on about how we need to preserve democracy and that Ukraine is a fight for democracy and defeating Trump is to save democracy. All this talk about democracy. Maybe if we're lucky, democracy will actually work and we will have peace because it's clear, like you said, that popular support for this project is bare bones. If you
Right,
look at the popularity of Western leaders, they're
right,
all down close to single digits now. They're down to
right,
like
right, right,
20%. Nobody
right,
likes them. So
right.
let's see. This will be a
Yeah,
test. Are we
yeah,
truly in a democracy? And will we be
right,
able to get leaders that want to negotiate and
yeah,
talk and have a peaceful solution?
right.
Or will we see that as they get increasingly desperate, as their numbers plummet, will they try to do everything in their power to start a war and seize more power and control it because they know that they're in a pickle of their own making?
Yeah.
That. So it's going to be
Yeah, no, it's,
interesting.
it's interesting, right? There are signs, but like you say, I think I mentioned that there was, I saw a photo of all the G7 leaders, and then with their, approval ratings, and they were negative all the way across. Deep. They're all deeply underwater, with the one exception. The one that wasn't doing too badly was Maloney, from
Hmm.
Italy, who apparently again has been drifting away from support for Ukraine. Yeah, so I mean that shows, yeah, that these people are in trouble, and there is a possibility of some kind of real shift in power in the West. I guess I've become cynical. It seems like we've come close to that in the past, but they just have a way of co-opting or uh, you know, maybe for example, well, first of all, in the UK, yeah, there is deep dissatisfaction with the Conservative government there, and so Labour is probably going to win handily. The Conservatives are just going to be thoroughly routed. But the thing is that Labour is just in the UK is virtually, an identical twin of the Conservatives. Nothing's going to change there.
Hmm.
Now in France, we could look at some real change, right? There's because Marine Le Pen's party is is poised to win big there. The thing is, well, first of all, like she's become increasingly kind of establishment. She's described as far right, which is silly. A lot of whatever these parties are called far right. Often they just have policies that would be considered centrist, like even just a couple decades ago, a generation ago. But they're called far right now, and that's true of her party in France. Now, when she, if she, she's already made a lot of compromises on things like immigration and foreign policy, but she still is an alternative. There's no question about it. She's said that we need to negotiate with Russia. That it's a mistake to these economic sanctions have been a mistake. Things like that. So maybe if eventually she becomes elected, her party, becomes the majority in the French parliament. I guess it's the National Assembly. There will be a real shift in policy. But I just kind of wonder just the power of the D state, the establishment, again and again, like you see even in this country, when people who seem to be offering a different vision, like Trump in 2016, they become elected, and when they get there, they amazingly end up doing the same thing. So we'll just have to see. Maybe this will be different. I think there's reasons to be at least hopeful in France that there will be a little shift, but we'll see.
Hmm. Okay. All right. Well, anything else you want to cover before we wrap it up? Any updates
Yeah.
on further updates on Ukraine or the Middle East?
Yeah, I guess let's see. I thought it would be interesting just to mention. I remember, I think it was a few episodes ago, you mentioned that like you had heard that an S-300 system had been hit and
Hmm.
across the border, from Kharkov, and I hadn't heard, but then later I did. Actually, coming from a Russian-leaning source. Um, but after that, I didn't see much about it. And then there was a series of stories about like S-400 systems being hit in Crimea, and some of those got a big play in Western media and in Taiwanese media that often is just a reflection of Western media. I saw it both in the Chinese version and the English version, but they had this. It looked like a Hollywood movie, seeing this was supposed to be an S-400 system, firing off these missiles and then getting hit and utterly destroyed, I guess missing the intended targets, and then the S-400 launcher is just left us with smoking ruin. And again, the thing looked like a Hollywood movie. I just think of that. I'm sorry, but that just can't be. I mean, like I've seen every time these things happen, the best you get is some sort of grainy satellite photo. Why would the Russians have like a film crew nearby and then release something that would not be to their advantage? So I don't know what was going on, but and both the story was always the same. It's like, wow, the S-400 was completely, devastated by the attackums. Boy, Turkey and India, these countries that have bought S-400s, they must be really worried now. Um, so you know, there was a lapse and an S-400 was destroyed, and the Western powers decided to play it up, and they actually provided their own footage and gave it to these media outlets around the world and told them what the storyline is. Like again, India and Turkey must be really upset now, because we've talked about how important these air defense systems are and how the prestige of the flagship American system, the Patriot system, took a real beating, recently, especially, in Israel, where the Israelis announced that they were just going to mothball it because didn't do anything. And that had to be a real blow. And you're just thinking, what's the main competition? It's probably the S-400. So they're just saying, man, we better do something, to protect our assets here. Again, it's not just geopolitics, it's also economics. These things, each Patriot system is or Patriot battery is $1.1 billion. So I just struck by that. I saw those reports and the S-300, and the thing is, I don't pretend to know. I'm not saying, now I know it's all phony. There's probably some truth to it. Like some of these, maybe the S-300 was really hit. Maybe the S-400 was damaged. Maybe one actually was destroyed. I don't know. But it seems clear to me that there was a deliberate effort to play it up, as part of this war of air defense systems that's going on. That's kind of, which is kind of taking place in addition to the real wars that are being fought.
Yeah, that's silly though. I mean, the countries that they're trying to woo, like let's say India or Turkey or Saudi Arabia,
Yeah.
we've lost them. They're gone. There's
Oh,
no coming back now. I mean, the only people that maybe we can get to continue
yeah.
to buy
Well,
our stuff,
yeah. I mean,
you
India
know.
has always been rather independent. And actually, India and Turkey, they both have been. I mean, Turkey has a tendency to always, play both sides. Yeah, yeah, but we are definitely worried about India. I think that there has been a shift towards Russia. They're never going to go completely become allies. I think it's been a real um, sort of a integral part of their foreign policy is neutrality, non-alignment, and that's been true
Mhm.
for many decades, and it will continue to be true.
It's a good policy to have,
Yeah, no, it is. It
like
is.
it's something I think a policy that every country should adopt.
Yeah,
It,
right, right.
it
And the,
just
the
makes
Russians
sense.
don't have a problem with it. It's like, yeah,
Mm,
okay, you do business with whoever you want to, but it's there's only one group of people.
yeah.
It's the so-called rules-based order. It's the U.S. and its close allies. that do not like non-alignment. It's like you're
Right.
with us or against us, and if you
Right. Yeah.
start doing business with the other side, we'll punish you.
Right. That's the game that we thought we're playing, and
Yeah,
that's all. Everything we're doing is for that. You're in our club or you're the enemy. And it's
yeah.
just not a good game to play. It's not going to end up well for us. Um, yeah, it's just fascinating times. I can't believe the world we live in. It's just so crazy. And having someone like Biden at the helm with Trump,
Right.
being,
And the
mugshots
wings, right, yeah.
it's just, and what's happening in Israel and Russia, and just it's all just it's a madhouse, and so many people just don't care, just
Yeah.
not interested. I
Actually, yeah,
just don't
right.
understand.
On that subject, I found this very interesting. There was a poll that came out recently from Russia. It was a poll conducted within Russia, and it found that 57% of the population in Russia believes that World War III could break out in the next 5 to 10 years.
Hmm.
Okay, now could doesn't mean that it will, or even
But
that
there
probably
people are
will, but,
aware of it.
but there's a realistic
Yeah.
possibility, enough that you ought to be worried about it.
Hmm.
And so that's 50, and only 13% thought, oh, it couldn't happen. I bet it would very likely be the completely reverse here. I mean, there's an awareness of what's going on, and I think here people are insulated to a great extent. They just don't understand, and they should.
Well, hopefully we're helping people understand bit by bit. Okay, all right then. I think we can end it there. Thanks a lot,
Okay.
Dad.